The city known to criminal history as one of America's most violent battlegrounds for organized crime was Cleveland, Ohio, which in the early decades of the 20th century was experiencing unprecedented industrial growth and a massive influx of European immigrants. Located on the southern shore of Lake Erie, Cleveland occupied a strategic position which would prove crucial to its criminal future, sitting directly across the water from Canada and connected by rail and road to major cities throughout the northeastern and midwestern United States. The city's population had grown dramatically from approximately 261,000 residents in 1890 to over 560,000 by 1910, making it the sixth largest city in the nation. This rapid expansion was driven primarily by the industrial boom which had transformed Cleveland into a major manufacturing center. Steel mills, oil refineries, and automobile factories dotted the landscape along the Cuyahoga River, providing employment for thousands of workers, but also creating a demand for vice and entertainment, which legitimate businesses could not or would not meet. The city's working-class neighborhoods consequently became home to gambling halls, brothels, and unlicensed saloons which operated with varying degrees of official tolerance. The immigrant populations which flooded into Cleveland during this period tended to settle in distinct ethnic enclaves throughout the city. Italians, many of them from Sicily and southern Italy, established themselves primarily in the neighborhood known as Murray Hill on the city's east side, clustering around Mayfield Road. Irish immigrants, who had been arriving in significant numbers since the mid-19th century, were dispersed more widely but maintained strong concentrations in several working-class districts. Eastern European Jews, Poles, Hungarians, and other groups each claimed their own territories, creating a patchwork of ethnic communities which would shape the city's criminal landscape for decades to come. Within these ethnic neighborhoods, criminal enterprises emerged which reflected both Old World traditions and New World opportunities. Italian immigrants brought with them the organizational structures and codes of conduct which had characterized secret criminal societies in Sicily, while Irish gangs drew on the traditions of political machines and labor racketeering which had flourished in Eastern American cities. These early criminal networks operated primarily in gambling, prostitution, and labor extortion, offering protection to businesses and mediating disputes within their respective communities. The growth of these criminal enterprises was facilitated by a political and law enforcement environment, which was at best indifferent and at worst actively complicit. Cleveland's municipal government during this period was characterized by machine politics and widespread corruption, with ward bosses controlling blocks of immigrant votes and distributing patronage accordingly. Police officers were often willing to overlook criminal activity in exchange for regular payments, while some actively participated in criminal schemes themselves. This atmosphere of official tolerance allowed organized crime to flourish in the years before the First World War, establishing networks and relationships which would prove crucial in the decade to follow. The Irish had been arriving in Cleveland in significant numbers since the mid-19th century, driven from their homeland by famine, poverty, and British colonial policies which had devastated rural Ireland. The Great Famine of 1845 to 1852 had killed approximately 1 million Irish people and forced another million to emigrate, many of them crossing the Atlantic to American cities, where they hoped to find work and security. Cleveland, with its growing industrial base and demand for manual labour, became a destination for thousands of these Irish immigrants, who settled initially in shanty towns along the Cuyahoga River and in the area known as the Flats. These early Irish arrivals faced considerable discrimination in their new home. Employment advertisements frequently included the phrase, "No Irish need apply," while anti-Catholic sentiment ran high among the established Protestant population. Irish immigrants were often relegated to the most dangerous and poorly paid jobs in the steel mills, on the railroads, and in the city's expanding infrastructure projects. This economic marginalization, combined with their concentration in working-class neighborhoods, created conditions in which alternative means of earning income became attractive to some members of the community. The Irish response to discrimination and economic hardship included both legitimate and illegitimate strategies. Irish immigrants became heavily involved in labour organising, forming unions in the steel mills and on the docks where they provided much of the workforce. They also began to establish a foothold in Cleveland's political machinery, with Irish ward bosses emerging in several districts by the 1880s and 1890s. These political connections would later prove valuable to those Irish residents who chose to pursue criminal enterprises, as friendly relationships with aldermen and police captains could provide protection from prosecution. Irish saloons became the centres of community life in working-class Irish neighbourhoods throughout Cleveland. These establishments served not only as places to drink, but as informal banks, employment agencies, and political clubhouses where ward bosses held court and dispensed patronage. Some of these saloons also functioned as headquarters for criminal operations, providing locations for illegal gambling and serving as meeting places for men involved in labour racketeering and protection schemes. The owners of these establishments often straddled the line between legitimate businessman and criminal operator, a duality which would characterise Irish organised crime in Cleveland for decades. By the 1890s and early 1900s, distinct Irish criminal gangs had emerged in several Cleveland neighbourhoods. These were not highly organised syndicates in the manner of later criminal enterprises, but rather loose confederations of men from the same neighbourhood or parish who engaged in various illegal activities together. Their operations centred primarily on gambling, running illegal lottery games known as policy or numbers, and extorting payments from local businesses in exchange for protection from vandalism or violence. Additionally, some Irish gangs became involved in labour racketeering, using threats and violence to control hiring on the docks and in construction projects. The structure of these early Irish gangs reflected the more egalitarian traditions of Irish culture and the American urban experience. Unlike the hierarchical organisations which characterised Italian organised crime, Irish gangs tended to operate as loose associations of equals, with leadership being informal and often contested. This organisational structure would later prove to be both a strength and a weakness, allowing for flexibility and independence but also creating vulnerabilities when confronted with more disciplined opposition. Several individuals emerged as prominent figures in Cleveland's Irish criminal underworld during the early 20th century. Among them was Danny Hogan, who controlled much of the gambling in the Irish neighbourhoods on the Near West Side and maintained close relationships with several city councilmen. Another significant figure was John Joyce, known as Shondor Burns' predecessor, who operated protection rackets along the lakefront and had connections to the Longshoremen's Union. These men and others like them established the networks and traditions which would be inherited by the next generation of Irish criminals when Prohibition transformed the criminal landscape entirely. The Irish community's involvement in legitimate politics also provided cover and connections for criminal activity. By the 1910s, Irish politicians held numerous positions in Cleveland city government, including seats on the city council and positions in the police department. While many of these individuals were honest public servants, others were willing to accept payments from criminals in exchange for protection, or to look the other way when illegal activities occurred in their districts. This interweaving of legitimate politics and criminal enterprise would become a defining characteristic of Irish organised crime in Cleveland. By the time the United States entered the First World War in 1917, the Irish criminal networks in Cleveland were well established but still relatively modest in their scope and ambitions compared to what was to come. They controlled gambling operations in several neighbourhoods, had influence over some labour unions, and maintained profitable relationships with corrupt politicians and police officers. However, they were not yet the wealthy and powerful organisations they would become in the 1920s. As the Irish were establishing their criminal networks in Cleveland, another ethnic group was arriving in the city with its own traditions of organised crime, traditions which had been refined over centuries in the villages and cities of southern Italy. We are fortunate to possess extensive details about Cleveland's gang war between Irish and Italian criminal factions, not because the participants kept diaries or composed memoirs as some later organised crime figures would do, but because federal and local law enforcement agencies compiled substantial files during their investigations into the violence which plagued the city. The Federal Bureau of Investigation maintained a dedicated Cleveland field office which produced thousands of pages of reports documenting the activities of both Irish and Italian criminal organisations, including surveillance logs, wiretap transcripts, and informant debriefings. These files, many of which have since been declassified and are available to researchers, provide detailed accounts of criminal operations, leadership structures, and specific violent incidents. Additionally, the Cuyahoga County Prosecutor's Office and the Cleveland Police Department generated extensive documentation through their investigations into the numerous homicides which occurred during the gang war. Homicide investigation files include witness statements, forensic evidence reports, and crime scene photographs, which offer grim testimony to the brutality of the conflict. While many of these cases remained unsolved owing to the code of silence which prevailed in both criminal communities, the investigative files nonetheless preserve valuable information about the methods and patterns of violence employed by both sides. Court records constitute another crucial source of information about Cleveland's gang war. When prosecutions did occur, either at the state or federal level, the resulting trial transcripts provide first-hand testimony from witnesses, victims, and occasionally from the participants themselves. Grand jury proceedings, indictments, and sentencing hearings all generated documentation which helps establish the timeline and key events of the conflict. Moreover, civil cases brought by the families of victims and by businesses damaged in the violence produced additional testimony and evidence which supplements the criminal case files. Newspaper coverage from Cleveland's major daily publications, particularly the Cleveland Plain Dealer and the Cleveland Press, offers contemporary accounts of the gang war as it unfolded. These newspapers devoted considerable attention to the violence, publishing detailed stories about murders, bombings, and police investigations. While some of this coverage was sensationalized and not always accurate in its details, the newspapers nonetheless provide valuable information about how the conflict was perceived by the public and which incidents generated the most concern. Furthermore, the newspapers occasionally published photographs of crime scenes and of the individuals involved, creating a visual record which supplements the written documentation. Supplementing this official documentation are accounts by individuals who witnessed the violence firsthand or who had knowledge of the criminal organizations involved. Some former members of both Irish and Italian gangs eventually cooperated with law enforcement and provided testimony about internal operations, decision-making processes, and specific criminal acts. While such testimony must be evaluated carefully, given the motivations of those providing it, these accounts offer insights into the organizations which official surveillance often could not penetrate. Additionally, civilians who lived in the neighborhoods where the violence occurred have provided oral histories and written accounts describing the atmosphere of fear which prevailed during the most intense periods of the conflict. However, significant limitations exist in the historical record of Cleveland's gang war. The code of silence which operated in both criminal communities meant that many participants never spoke about their activities, taking their knowledge to their graves. Evidence was often destroyed by the criminals themselves, and witnesses were frequently too frightened to cooperate with investigators. Moreover, corruption within law enforcement agencies meant that some investigations were compromised from the beginning, with evidence disappearing or being suppressed to protect those with political connections. Consequently, while we possess substantial documentation about Cleveland's gang war, the full extent of the violence and the complete details of many incidents remain unknown. As a consequence, we are able to develop a detailed picture of the conflict and its major participants, though gaps inevitably remain in our understanding of certain events and motivations. The organization known throughout the world as the Mafia, or more properly La Cosa Nostra, had its roots in the rural villages of Sicily, where for centuries secret criminal societies had operated in the power vacuum left by weak central government authority. These societies, emerging from the chaos of foreign occupation and feudal oppression, developed elaborate codes of honor and silence which governed their operations and protected members from outside interference. The term mafia itself, though its etymology remains debated, came to denote these criminal organizations which offered protection, mediated disputes, and exacted tribute from landowners and peasants alike in western Sicily. The organizational structure of the Sicilian mafia was hierarchical and disciplined, built around the concept of the famiglia, or family, which bound members together through oaths of loyalty and blood. At the head of each family stood the capo or boss, who exercised absolute authority over his men and maintained relationships with other families through a system of alliances and mutual respect. Below the capo were various ranks of soldiers and associates, each with defined roles and responsibilities within the organization. Central to the mafia's power was the code of omertà, the oath of silence which forbade members from cooperating with government authorities under any circumstances and which prescribed death as the penalty for betrayal. Italian immigration to the United States accelerated dramatically in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, driven by poverty, overpopulation, and limited economic opportunities in southern Italy and Sicily. Between 1880 and 1920, approximately 4 million Italian immigrants arrived in America, with the majority coming from the impoverished southern regions and from Sicily. Many of these immigrants were honest labourers seeking better lives for their families, but among them were individuals with connections to the criminal societies of their homeland, who saw opportunities to transplant their operations to American soil. Cleveland received a significant portion of this Italian immigration, with thousands of Italian families settling in the city during the early decades of the 20th century. The neighbourhood which became the centre of Italian life in Cleveland was Murray Hill on the city's east side, particularly the area along Mayfield Road, between East 119th Street and East 125th Street. Here Italian immigrants established businesses, churches and social clubs which served the community and maintained connections to the culture and traditions of their homeland. By 1920 the area was so heavily Italian that it became known colloquially as Little Italy, and it would remain the heart of Italian Cleveland for generations. Among the Italian immigrants who settled in Cleveland were individuals with connections to Sicilian Mafia families, and these men began establishing operations similar to those they had known in Sicily. The earliest manifestation of organised Italian crime in Cleveland was the so-called Black Hand, extortion racket, which plagued Italian businesses and wealthy Italian immigrants in the early 1900s. Victims would receive letters adorned with threatening symbols, often including a black handprint, demanding payment of specified sums on penalty of violence, property destruction, or death. Those who refused to pay frequently found their businesses bombed or burned, while some were assaulted or murdered as examples to others. The Black Hand extortion operations in Cleveland were conducted by several competing groups of Italian criminals, rather than by a single, unified organisation. However, by the 1910s, a process of consolidation was beginning, as stronger groups eliminated or absorbed weaker ones, and as leaders emerged who commanded the respect and fear necessary to establish authority over Cleveland's Italian criminal underworld. Among the most significant of these early leaders was Joseph Leonardo, who had immigrated to Cleveland from Sicily in 1900 and who began his criminal career in the Black Hand rackets before expanding into other enterprises. Leonardo and other Italian criminals in Cleveland maintained connections with Mafia families in other American cities, particularly in New York, where the organizational structures of La Cosa Nostra were being firmly established. These connections allowed for cooperation in criminal enterprises which crossed city boundaries and provided a support network which Italian criminals could call upon when needed. Moreover, the hierarchical structure of the Mafia, with its clear chains of command and its emphasis on loyalty and discipline, gave Italian organised crime a cohesion which other ethnic criminal groups often lacked. By 1920, the Mafia presence in Cleveland was firmly established, with a sophisticated organisational structure that would prove more resilient than the loosely organised Irish gangs operating elsewhere in the city. The Italian criminal organisations controlled the Black Hand rackets in their neighbourhoods, operated illegal gambling establishments and brothels, and were beginning to extend their influence into labour racketeering on construction sites and in the garment industry where Italian workers were concentrated. The stage was set for a massive expansion of their operations, an expansion which would bring them into direct conflict with the established Irish criminal networks. On the 17th of January 1920, the 18th Amendment to the United States Constitution went into effect, prohibiting the manufacture, sale and transportation of alcoholic beverages throughout the nation. This amendment, which had been championed by temperance advocates for decades and which Congress had passed the previous year, was intended to reduce crime, poverty, and social problems associated with alcohol consumption. Instead, it would have precisely the opposite effect, transforming small-time criminals into wealthy gangsters and sparking a wave of violence which would plague American cities throughout the 1920s. For Cleveland, with its strategic location on Lake Erie, directly across from Canada, where alcohol remained legal, Prohibition would prove to be a catalyst which turned scattered ethnic criminal networks into organised empires and set the stage for one of the deadliest gang wars in the nation's history. The immediate impact of Prohibition on Cleveland's criminal landscape was transformative. What had been a relatively modest trade in illegal gambling and vice suddenly became dwarfed by the enormous profits available in bootlegging, the illegal manufacture and distribution of alcoholic beverages. Within weeks of Prohibition's implementation, criminal organizations in Cleveland were scrambling to establish supply lines, distribution networks, and protection arrangements which would allow them to capitalize on the public's continued thirst for alcohol. The fact that the American public had never strongly supported Prohibition, and that many regarded drinking as a personal choice rather than a criminal act, meant that demand for illegal alcohol would be nearly limitless. Cleveland's geographic position made it ideally suited for bootlegging operations. The city sat on the southern shore of Lake Erie, directly across the water from Ontario, Canada, where alcohol production and sale remained entirely legal. The distance across the lake was short enough that fast boats could make the crossing in under an hour, even at night and in rough weather. Moreover, the lake's coastline was difficult for law enforcement to patrol effectively, with numerous coves, inlets, and private docks where boats could land their illicit cargo with minimal risk of detection. Consequently, Cleveland quickly became one of the primary entry points for Canadian whiskey entering the United States, rivaling Detroit in the volume of alcohol smuggled across its borders. The mechanics of the bootlegging trade in Cleveland involved several stages, each of which represented an opportunity for criminal profit. Canadian distillers and brewers, operating legally in their own country, were more than willing to sell their products to American buyers, regardless of how those products would be transported across the border. Smugglers, using fast boats which became known as rum runners, would meet Canadian suppliers at designated points on the lake, load their cargo, and make the crossing to Cleveland under cover of darkness. Once the alcohol reached Cleveland shores, it had to be unloaded, warehoused, and then distributed to the city's numerous speakeasies, illegal saloons which operated behind the facades of legitimate businesses or in private clubs. Both Irish and Italian criminal organizations in Cleveland immediately recognized the opportunities which Prohibition presented, and both moved quickly to establish their positions in the bootlegging trade. The Irish, with their existing control over many of the lakefront areas and their connections to longshoremen and dock workers, initially held advantages in the smuggling aspect of the operation. Irish gangs established relationships with Canadian suppliers and organized boat crews willing to risk the dangerous lake crossings. Meanwhile, the Italian organizations, with their more hierarchical structure and their control over many businesses in their neighborhoods, focused initially on establishing speakeasies and distribution networks in the areas under their influence. In the early years of Prohibition, there was a degree of cooperation between Irish and Italian criminal organizations in Cleveland, born partly of necessity and partly of the recognition that the profits available were sufficient for multiple groups to prosper. Irish smugglers would sell Canadian whiskey to Italian distributors, who would then sell it through their own speakeasies and to their own customers. Similarly, when Italian organizations began establishing their own smuggling operations, they would sometimes use Irish contacts on the docks to facilitate the unloading and warehousing of their shipments. This cooperation was never formalized in any written agreements, but rather existed as a series of understandings between individuals who recognized the mutual benefits of avoiding conflict. However, this initial cooperation was built on a foundation of ethnic suspicion and economic competition which would prove unsustainable as the stakes increased. Irish and Italian criminal groups had different organizational cultures, different codes of honor, and different expectations about how criminal enterprises should be conducted. Irish gangs, with their more egalitarian structure and their connections to legitimate politics, sometimes viewed the Italians as foreigners who did not understand American ways. Italian criminals, with their emphasis on hierarchy and their code of omertà, regarded some of the Irish as undisciplined and untrustworthy. These cultural differences created friction even during the period of nominal cooperation. The enormous profits generated by bootlegging also created powerful incentives for both Irish and Italian organizations to expand their operations and to encroach on territories which had previously been respected as belonging to the other side. A successful speakeasy could generate thousands of dollars per week in revenue, while a well-organized smuggling operation could bring in tens of thousands of dollars per month. These were sums which dwarfed the profits from gambling and other traditional criminal enterprises, and which made territorial control increasingly valuable. By the mid-1920s, both Irish and Italian organizations in Cleveland were seeking to expand beyond their traditional neighborhoods and to establish dominance over the lucrative downtown area where the wealthiest customers could be found. The corruption of Cleveland's police force and municipal government, which had existed on a modest scale before Prohibition, expanded dramatically during the 1920s as criminal organizations used their bootlegging profits to buy protection from law enforcement. Police officers assigned to patrol the lakefront could be paid to look the other way when rum runners landed their cargo, while detectives could be bribed to ignore the operation of speakeasies or to warn their operators before raids were conducted. At higher levels, police commanders and even some city officials accepted regular payments from criminal organisations in exchange for ensuring that enforcement efforts were directed elsewhere. This corruption was not limited to any single ethnic group, with both Irish and Italian criminals maintaining their own networks of paid officials, though Irish criminals generally had better political connections owing to their longer presence in Cleveland and their involvement in ward politics. By 1925, the first serious tensions between Irish and Italian criminal organisations were beginning to surface in Cleveland. These tensions initially manifested in disputes over specific territories or over the rights to supply particular speakeasies, disputes which might previously have been resolved through negotiation, but which now increasingly turned violent. An Irish gang might attempt to force an Italian-owned speakeasy in a mixed neighbourhood to buy its liquor from Irish suppliers rather than from Italian sources, or an Italian organisation might pressure the owner of a warehouse in an Irish area to allow the storage of Italian-smuggled whiskey. When such pressure met with resistance, violence often followed. The first recorded killing, which appeared to be connected to bootlegging rivalry between Irish and Italian criminals, occurred in Cleveland on the 7th of March 1925, when an Irish bootlegger named Patrick O'Malley was shot to death outside a speakeasy on the near west side. Witnesses reported seeing two men flee the scene in an automobile, and though the killers were never positively identified, it was widely believed in the criminal underworld that the murder had been carried out by associates of an Italian gang which had been attempting to extend its distribution network into O'Malley's territory. No arrests were made in the case, and the murder went unsolved, as would many of the killings which followed in the years to come. The O'Malley killing was followed by a series of similar incidents throughout 1925 and 1926, in which bootleggers and speakeasy owners from both ethnic groups were murdered in circumstances which suggested they had been killed by rivals. On the 14th of August 1925, an Italian speakeasy owner named Salvatore Cianci was killed when a bomb exploded in his establishment on Mayfield Road, destroying the building and killing 3 customers in addition to Cianci. Police investigators believed the bomb had been placed by Irish criminals seeking to eliminate competition, though again no arrests were made. On the 2nd of November 1925, another Irish bootlegger, James Connolly, was ambushed and shot while driving on Detroit Avenue, dying at the scene before help could arrive. These early killings established patterns which would characterize the violence in the years to come. Most of the murders were carried out either by shooting or by bombing, with the killers typically fleeing before police could arrive. Witnesses, when any could be found, invariably claimed to have seen nothing useful or to be unable to identify the perpetrators. The code of silence operated effectively in both Irish and Italian criminal communities, making prosecutions nearly impossible even in the rare cases when suspects were identified. Moreover, police investigations were often perfunctory, with detectives showing little enthusiasm for solving crimes in which both victims and perpetrators were known criminals. The violence escalated throughout 1926 as both sides began to abandon restraint and to target not merely competitors, but anyone associated with the rival ethnic group's criminal operations. In February 1926, an explosion destroyed a warehouse on the lakefront, where Irish bootleggers had been storing Canadian whiskey, resulting in the deaths of 2 men who were inside the building at the time. In response, Irish gunmen shot and killed an Italian rum runner as he left his home in the Murray Hill neighbourhood in April 1926. By the summer of that year, murders related to the bootlegging rivalry were occurring at a rate of approximately 1 per month, and Cleveland's newspapers were beginning to take notice of what they termed the beer wars or booze battles in their headlines. The increasing violence began to affect not only the criminals themselves but also the broader community in Cleveland. Bombings damaged nearby buildings and sometimes injured innocent bystanders, while shootouts occasionally occurred in public places where civilians might be present. Legitimate business owners in neighbourhoods where speakeasies operated lived in fear that they might be caught in the crossfire of gang violence, or that their establishments might be mistaken for illegal operations and targeted accordingly. Property values in some areas began to decline as residents sought to move away from the violence, while insurance companies raised rates or refused to insure businesses in high-crime areas. Despite the mounting death toll, both Irish and Italian criminal organisations continued to prosper from bootlegging throughout this period. The violence, while deadly for individuals, did not significantly disrupt the flow of illegal alcohol into Cleveland or its distribution to the city's thirsty customers. Speakeasies continued to operate openly in many neighbourhoods, with only token efforts by police to shut them down. Rum runners continued to cross Lake Erie nightly with their cargoes of Canadian whiskey, and warehouses continued to store thousands of gallons of illegal alcohol awaiting distribution. The enormous profits from bootlegging made it possible for both sides to absorb the losses from violence and to continue recruiting new members to replace those who were killed. Law enforcement's response to the escalating violence was largely ineffective during this period. The Cleveland Police Department, compromised by corruption and lacking the resources to conduct thorough investigations, solved few of the bootlegging-related murders. Federal prohibition agents charged with enforcing the Volstead Act, which provided the legal framework for prohibition, focused primarily on seizing illegal alcohol rather than investigating the violence between bootlegging organizations. Meanwhile, local prosecutors found it nearly impossible to secure convictions in the rare cases when suspects were arrested, as witnesses refused to testify and evidence mysteriously disappeared. Consequently, criminals on both sides operated with a sense of impunity, believing correctly that they were unlikely to face legal consequences for their actions. Attempts at negotiating peace between Irish and Italian criminal organizations were made by intermediaries on several occasions during 1926 and early 1927, but these efforts consistently failed. The fundamental problem was that both sides sought dominance over the lucrative bootlegging trade rather than merely a share of the profits, and neither was willing to accept a secondary position. Irish criminals, who had been established in Cleveland longer and who had better political connections, believed they deserved primacy in the criminal underworld. Italian criminals, with their more disciplined organization and their connections to Mafia families in other cities, believed their superior structure entitled them to leadership. These competing claims proved impossible to reconcile through negotiation. By the late 1920s, the initial cooperation between Irish and Italian criminal organizations in Cleveland was breaking down entirely, as the enormous profits from bootlegging made territorial control increasingly valuable, and both sides sought to expand their operations at the expense of their rivals. The scattered violence which had characterized 1925 and 1926 was intensifying, with murders becoming more frequent and more brazen. What had begun as occasional disputes over territory was evolving into a sustained campaign of violence in which both sides sought to eliminate their competition through force. The stage was set for the conflict to enter a new and far deadlier phase, one in which the violence would reach levels which would shock even a city grown accustomed to criminal warfare. Central to the escalating tensions between Irish and Italian criminal factions in Cleveland were several individuals who would emerge as the dominant figures in their respective organizations during the late 1920s. These men, driven by a combination of ethnic loyalty, personal ambition, and the enormous profits available in Prohibition-era bootlegging, would soon be locked in a conflict which would claim dozens of lives and terrorize entire neighborhoods. Understanding their backgrounds and the paths which led them to leadership positions in Cleveland's criminal underworld is essential to comprehending the violence which was about to unfold. The man who dominated the Italian criminal faction in Cleveland during this period was Joseph Leonardo, who had been born Giuseppe Leonardo in the Sicilian town of Licata in 1884. He had immigrated to Cleveland with his family in 1900, when he was still just 16 years of age, settling in the Murray Hill neighborhood where other Sicilian immigrants had already established a community. Leonardo's early years in America were spent working in legitimate employment, including a stint in a local bakery, but by his early 20s he had become involved in the Black Hand extortion rackets, which plagued Italian businesses in Cleveland. His intelligence, ruthlessness, and willingness to use violence against those who refused to pay tribute quickly established his reputation within the Italian criminal community. By 1920, Leonardo had risen to become the most powerful Italian criminal in Cleveland, recognized by other mafia families in cities such as New York and Chicago as the de facto boss of Cleveland's Italian underworld. He operated from a base on Mayfield Road, where he owned several businesses including a corn sugar warehouse, corn sugar being a key ingredient in the illegal production of alcohol. This warehouse provided a convenient cover for his bootlegging operations, while also generating substantial legitimate profits. Leonardo was known for his ability to maintain discipline within his organization through a combination of loyalty rewards and severe punishment for those who betrayed him or showed disrespect. Associates later testified that Leonardo personally participated in several murders of Italian criminals who had challenged his authority though he was never convicted of these crimes. Leonardo's organization during the Prohibition era included several brothers and other family members who occupied positions of trust and authority. His brother John Leonardo served as his closest advisor and enforcer, while other brothers controlled various aspects of the family's criminal operations. This nepotistic structure was characteristic of Mafia families, reflecting the Sicilian tradition of placing ultimate trust only in blood relatives and of keeping criminal enterprises within the family to minimize the risk of betrayal. The Leonardo organization by the mid-1920s controlled the majority of Italian bootlegging operations in Cleveland, operated numerous speakeasies in the Murray Hill and surrounding neighborhoods, and had established connections with Canadian liquor suppliers, which allowed them to smuggle large quantities of whiskey across Lake Erie. However, Leonardo's dominance of the Italian criminal faction in Cleveland would not go unchallenged indefinitely. Younger and more ambitious members of the Italian underworld chafed under his leadership and sought opportunities to establish their own power bases. Among these was Salvatore Black Sam Todaro, who had been born in Sicily in 1894 and had immigrated to Cleveland as a young man. Todaro had worked his way up through the ranks of Leonardo's organization during the early 1920s, proving himself as an effective enforcer and bootlegger. By 1927 he controlled several profitable speakeasies and had established his own connections with Canadian suppliers, making him increasingly independent of Leonardo's authority. The tension between Leonardo and Todaro would eventually lead to a violent rupture within the Italian criminal community, though that conflict lay several years in the future. The Irish criminal faction in Cleveland during the late 1920s was less centralized than the Italian organization, reflecting the more egalitarian and loosely structured nature of Irish criminal enterprises. Rather than a single boss who commanded absolute authority, the Irish had several leaders who controlled different territories and who cooperated or competed with one another depending on circumstances. Among the most prominent of these Irish leaders was John Patrick Big Jack Rogan, who had been born in Cleveland in 1889 to Irish immigrant parents from County Cork. Rogan had grown up in the tough neighborhoods near the Cuyahoga River and had been involved in street crime from his teenage years. By the time Prohibition was enacted in 1920, Rogan controlled much of the bootlegging activity on Cleveland's west side, operating from a base in the neighborhood known as the Angle. He owned several saloons which became speakeasies after Prohibition went into effect, and he had established relationships with Canadian suppliers even before alcohol became illegal, having previously smuggled legitimate goods to avoid tariffs. Rogan was known for his physical imposing presence, standing well over 6 feet tall and weighing more than 250 pounds, as well as for his quick temper and willingness to personally engage in violence when he believed it necessary. Police records indicate that Rogan was arrested numerous times during the 1920s on charges ranging from assault to bootlegging, but that he was never convicted owing to his ability to bribe witnesses and corrupt police officers. Another significant figure in the Irish criminal faction was Thomas Red Tom Kelly, who had been born in 1892 and who controlled bootlegging operations in several neighborhoods on Cleveland's east side. Kelly was younger than Rogan and was known for being more calculating and less impulsive, preferring to avoid violence when negotiation or bribery could achieve his objectives. However, when violence became necessary, Kelly showed no reluctance to employ it, and several murders were attributed to him or his associates during the 1920s, though again no convictions resulted. Kelly had particularly strong political connections, having worked as an enforcer for a ward boss in his younger years, and having maintained those relationships as he moved into bootlegging. These political connections gave him some advance warning of police raids and ensured that prosecutions against him were rarely pursued with vigour. The relationship between Rogan and Kelly, while nominally cooperative, was marked by underlying competition and distrust. Both men sought to expand their operations and neither was willing to defer to the other's authority in the manner that Italian criminals deferred to Leonardo. This lack of unity among Irish criminal leaders would eventually prove to be a weakness when confronted with the more disciplined Italian organisation, though in the late 1920s it was not yet apparent how significant this structural difference would become. The territories controlled by these various leaders created a patchwork of criminal fiefdoms across Cleveland. Leonardo's Italian organisation dominated the Murray Hill neighbourhood and the surrounding east side areas with large Italian populations. Rogan's Irish operation controlled much of the west side, particularly the neighbourhoods near the lake where smuggling operations were concentrated. Kelly controlled several East Side neighbourhoods where Irish and other non-Italian populations lived. These territorial divisions had emerged organically during the early years of Prohibition and had been generally respected through the mid-1920s, but as profits from bootlegging increased, and as ambitious younger criminals sought to expand their operations, the boundaries were becoming increasingly contested. The business operations of these criminal leaders extended beyond bootlegging to include gambling, loan sharking, and labour racketeering. Rogan controlled illegal gambling operations in numerous speakeasies and private clubs, taking a percentage of the profits from card games, dice games, and numbers rackets. Leonardo had expanded into labour racketeering by gaining control over several construction unions, allowing him to extort payments from contractors who wished to avoid labour problems. Kelly operated a loan sharking business, which provided high-interest loans to desperate individuals using the threat of violence to ensure repayment. These diverse criminal enterprises made the leaders wealthy and gave them the financial resources to maintain the armed men who enforced their will. The personalities of these men also contributed to the tensions which were building between Irish and Italian criminal factions. Leonardo was known for his adherence to the Code of Omertà and his insistence on absolute loyalty from his subordinates. He regarded the Irish criminals as undisciplined and untrustworthy, men who had not been properly initiated into the traditions of organised crime and who consequently could not be relied upon to honour agreements. Rogan, for his part, viewed the Italians as foreigners who had arrived in Cleveland after the Irish had already established themselves, and who consequently had no right to dictate terms or demand deference. These mutual attitudes of superiority and resentment poisoned the relationship between the two factions and made conflict increasingly likely. The violent reputations of these leaders were well established by the late 1920s. Leonardo was believed to have personally participated in at least 3 murders, including the killing of a rival Italian bootlegger in 1924 and the murder of a Black-Hand extortionist who had attempted to extort money from Italian businesses without Leonardo's permission. Rogan had reportedly beaten several men severely enough to hospitalize them, and was suspected of involvement in at least 2 murders of rival bootleggers. Kelly was known for his use of bombs to eliminate competition, with several speakeasies and warehouses belonging to his rivals having been destroyed by explosions which were attributed to Kelly's organization. These acts of violence established the credibility of each leader's threats and ensured that their subordinates understood the consequences of disloyalty or failure. The family lives of these criminal leaders varied considerably. Leonardo was married with several children and maintained a respectable facade as a legitimate businessman living in a substantial house in Murray Hill and attending Mass regularly at the local Catholic church. His family was largely insulated from his criminal activities, with his wife and children appearing to believe that his wealth came entirely from his legitimate businesses. Rogan was also married but was known to maintain several mistresses in different neighbourhoods, a common practice among successful criminals of the era. Kelly remained unmarried, apparently preferring to devote his full attention to his criminal enterprises rather than to domestic life. The tensions between these leaders and their organisations were personal as well as organisational. An incident in early 1927 illustrated how minor disputes could escalate quickly, owing to the ethnic hostilities which existed between the factions. One of Rogan's bootleggers was stopped by police while transporting a load of Canadian whiskey through a neighbourhood controlled by Leonardo's organisation. Rather than simply confiscating the alcohol, the police, who were being paid by Leonardo to protect his territory, called associates of Leonardo to the scene. These Italian criminals seized the whiskey and beat Rogan's bootlegger severely before allowing him to leave. When Rogan learned of this incident, he was reportedly furious and demanded that Leonardo return the whiskey and compensate him for the loss. Leonardo refused, stating that the Irish bootlegger had been operating in Italian territory without permission and had consequently forfeited his cargo. This incident nearly led to immediate violence, with Rogan reportedly dispatching armed men to confront Leonardo directly. Only the intervention of the mutual business associates, who convinced both sides that open warfare would bring unwanted police attention, prevented a shootout. However, the incident left both leaders deeply resentful, and it demonstrated how fragile the peace between Irish and Italian factions had become. Similar confrontations occurred with increasing frequency throughout 1927, each one bringing the two sides closer to outright war. These men, driven by ethnic animosity, territorial ambition, and the enormous wealth available in Prohibition-era Cleveland, would soon abandon any remaining pretense of cooperation and embark on a campaign of violence which would leave many of them dead and would terrorize the city for years to come. The stage was set, the antagonists were in position, and the first shots of what would become a sustained gang war were about to be fired. On the 23rd of May 1927, a shooting occurred outside a speakeasy on West 25th Street, which would mark the beginning of open warfare between Cleveland's Irish and Italian criminal factions. The victim was Michael "Mickey" Dunn, a 28-year-old bootlegger who worked for John Patrick "Big Jack" Rogan, and who had been responsible for collecting payments from several speakeasies in neighbourhoods which Irish criminals considered their territory. Dunn had been leaving the speakeasy at approximately 11 o'clock in the evening when two men approached him on the street and opened fire with pistols at close range. He was struck 4 times and died at the scene before an ambulance could arrive. The killers fled in a waiting automobile which witnesses described as a dark sedan, though none could provide more specific details about the vehicle or its occupants. Police investigators determined that Dunn had been involved in a dispute with associates of Joseph Leonardo over the previous weeks concerning the right to supply liquor to several speakeasies in mixed neighbourhoods where both Irish and Italian residents lived. Dunn had reportedly threatened violence against Italian bootleggers who attempted to enter what he considered Irish territory, and he had personally confronted several Italian distributors and warned them to stay away from certain establishments. The murder was widely interpreted in Cleveland's criminal underworld as retaliation by Leonardo's organisation for Dunn's. Aggressive territorial expansion, though no arrests were ever made and the killing remained officially unsolved. Rogan's response to Dunn's murder was swift and brutal. On the 2nd of June 1927, less than 2 weeks after Dunn was killed, an explosion destroyed a corn sugar warehouse on Mayfield Road, which was owned by one of Leonardo's associates. The blast occurred at approximately 3 o'clock in the morning when the building was unoccupied, but the destruction was total, with the warehouse collapsing and several nearby buildings suffering significant damage. Fire investigators concluded that a large quantity of dynamite had been used, placed strategically to ensure maximum destruction. While no one was killed in the explosion, the financial loss to Leonardo's organisation was substantial, as the warehouse had contained thousands of pounds of corn sugar worth tens of thousands of dollars on the black market. The bombing of the warehouse represented an escalation in tactics, moving beyond individual murders to attacks on the economic infrastructure of the rival organisation. Leonardo interpreted this as a declaration of war, and his response made clear that he intended to meet Irish aggression with overwhelming force. On the 17th of June 1927, 2 Irish bootleggers, Patrick Flynn and James O'Brien, were ambushed while driving on St. Clair Avenue. Their automobile was forced to stop by a truck which pulled in front of them, and armed men emerged from the truck and from a following vehicle and opened fire on the 2 men. Both Flynn and O'Brien were killed in the fusillade, with police later recovering more than 40 spent cartridge cases from the scene. Several civilian witnesses observed the attack, but none could or would identify the shooters, and no arrests followed. The double murder on St. Clair Avenue shocked Cleveland's public and drew extensive newspaper coverage, with the Cleveland Plain Dealer running a front-page story headlined "Gang War Erupts in Beer Battle." The article detailed the previous incidents of violence and quoted police officials who acknowledged that they were facing a sustained conflict between criminal organisations. However, the police response remained largely ineffective, hampered by corruption, lack of resources, and the refusal of witnesses to cooperate with investigations. The deaths of Flynn and O'Brien went unpunished, as would most of the killings which followed in the months and years to come. Throughout the summer of 1927, the violence continued to escalate, as both sides abandoned any remaining restraint and began targeting anyone associated with the opposing faction. On the 8th of July 1927, an Italian speakeasy owner named Vincenzo Moretti was shot and killed in his establishment on Murray Hill by 2 gunmen who entered through the front door, fired multiple shots, and fled before patrons could react. On the 23rd of July 1927, an Irish rum runner named Sean McCarthy was found dead in his apartment on the west side, having been shot several times at close range in what appeared to be a professional execution. On the 11th of August 1927, a bomb exploded in a garage where Rogan kept several vehicles used in bootlegging operations, destroying 2 trucks and killing a mechanic who was working late. The methods employed in these attacks reveal the different tactical approaches favoured by Irish and Italian criminals. Italian gunmen tended to favour careful planning and precision, often conducting surveillance of their targets before striking and using multiple shooters to ensure success. The murder of Flynn and O'Brien exemplified this approach, with the ambush clearly having been planned in advance and executed by a coordinated team. Irish criminals, by contrast, often favoured bombings, which allowed for attacks without the need to confront victims directly, and which created spectacular destruction that served as both practical damage and psychological intimidation. The bombing of Leonardo's warehouse and the destruction of Rogan's garage illustrated this preference. As the death toll mounted, fear began to spread through the neighbourhoods where the violence was concentrated. Residents of areas near speakeasies or known gang hangouts lived in constant anxiety that they might be caught in the crossfire of a shootout, or that a bombing intended for criminals might damage their homes or businesses. Some families, whose residences were near targeted locations, began sending their children to stay with relatives in safer neighbourhoods, while business owners increased their insurance coverage or in some cases closed their establishments temporarily until the violence subsided. The economic impact of the gang war was beginning to affect legitimate businesses and working-class families who had no involvement in criminal activity. The Code of Silence, which operated in both Irish and Italian communities, made it nearly impossible for police to gather evidence or identify suspects in the killings. Witnesses who saw murders or bombings invariably claimed to have seen nothing useful when questioned by investigators, either out of fear of retaliation or out of ethnic loyalty to the criminals from their own community. On several occasions, witnesses who initially agreed to provide information to police later recanted their statements, sometimes claiming they had been mistaken, and other times simply refusing to cooperate further. This wall of silence protected killers on both sides and ensured that prosecutions would be rare. However, some residents of the affected neighbourhoods did speak to journalists, albeit anonymously, about the atmosphere of terror which prevailed during this period. A resident of Murray Hill, quoted in the Cleveland Press in August 1927, described how people hurried home after dark and avoided being on the streets unnecessarily. Another resident from the West Side told a reporter that parents were keeping children indoors in the evenings and that neighbours had organised informal watch systems to alert each other if suspicious vehicles appeared in their area. These accounts provided a glimpse into how the gang war was affecting ordinary people who simply wanted to live their lives without fear of violence. The escalating violence created internal tensions within both criminal organisations, as some members began to question whether the conflict was worth the cost. Several bootleggers on both sides were known to have expressed concerns that the war was drawing too much police attention, and that the constant violence was bad for business, as speakeasy customers were sometimes staying away from establishments they feared might be targeted. However, these concerns were overwhelmed by the imperatives of ethnic loyalty, personal honour, and the desire for revenge which drove the leadership of both factions. Leonardo and Rogan had each lost associates and subordinates to the violence, and neither was willing to appear weak by calling for peace. An attempt to negotiate a truce was made in September 1927 by several legitimate businessmen who had connections to both Irish and Italian criminal leaders. These intermediaries, motivated partly by civic concern and partly by their own economic interest in seeing the violence end, arranged a meeting between representatives of both factions at a neutral location. The meeting was attended not by Leonardo and Rogan themselves, but by trusted lieutenants who had authority to negotiate on behalf of their bosses. According to later accounts, the meeting quickly broke down over the question of territorial boundaries, with neither side willing to cede control over the disputed neighbourhoods where the most profitable speakeasies were located. The Irish representatives demanded that Italians restrict their operations to Murray Hill and immediate surrounding areas, while the Italian representatives insisted on the right to operate anywhere in Cleveland where there were Italian customers. These incompatible demands doomed the peace effort. The failure of the September peace negotiations was followed by a period of even more intense violence. On the 7th of October 1927, Salvatore Black Sam Todaro, who had been growing increasingly independent of Leonardo's control, was shot and seriously wounded while walking near his home. He survived the assassination attempt but was hospitalized for several weeks, and the incident appeared to be the work of Irish gunmen, seeking to eliminate one of the most aggressive Italian bootleggers. On the 19th of October 1927, an Irish speakeasy owner named Thomas Sullivan was killed when a bomb was placed under his automobile, the explosion occurring when he started the engine and killing him instantly. On the 2nd of November 1927, 2 Italian bootleggers were shot while unloading Canadian whiskey from a boat at a lakefront dock, with both men dying from their wounds. The pattern of attack and retaliation had become self-sustaining, with each killing generating demands for revenge which led to further killings in an endless cycle. Neither side could back down without appearing weak, and neither could achieve a decisive victory that would end the conflict. The war had become, in effect, a contest of attrition in which both sides were willing to absorb significant casualties in hopes of eventually wearing down their opponents. This dynamic would characterize the gang war for the next several years, with periods of intense violence alternating with brief lulls when both sides paused to regroup and plan their next moves. Law enforcement's inability to stop the violence was becoming increasingly apparent and increasingly embarrassing to city officials. Cleveland's mayor and police chief faced mounting criticism from civic leaders and ordinary citizens who demanded action to restore order and end the gang war. In response, police conducted several highly publicized raids on speakeasies and arrested dozens of bootleggers in the final months of 1927. However, these raids had little lasting impact, as most of those arrested were quickly released on bail and returned to their criminal activities. The raids appeared to be more for show than for substance, designed to create the appearance of action without actually disrupting the criminal organizations or addressing the violence. Federal prohibition agents also stepped up their enforcement efforts in Cleveland during this period, conducting raids on warehouses and seizing shipments of illegal alcohol. However, like the local police efforts, these federal actions failed to address the underlying gang war or to protect residents from the violence. The agents were focused on enforcing the Volstead Act and measuring their success by the quantity of alcohol seized rather than by reductions in violence or arrests of violent criminals. Consequently, their efforts, while generating favourable publicity, did little to make Cleveland streets safer. The corruption which pervaded law enforcement during this period also undermined any serious efforts to address the gang war. Police officers and even some federal agents were on the payroll of criminal organizations on both sides, providing warnings of impending raids and ensuring that investigations into murders and bombings went nowhere. In several documented cases, evidence in homicide investigations mysteriously disappeared from police custody, while witnesses who agreed to testify were visited by individuals who persuaded them to reconsider. This systemic corruption meant that criminal leaders on both sides operated with a reasonable expectation that they would face no serious legal consequences for their actions. By the end of 1927, approximately 20 people had been killed in violence directly attributed to the gang war between Irish and Italian criminal factions in Cleveland, while dozens more had been injured in shootings and bombings. The financial cost of the violence was also substantial, with properties destroyed, businesses forced to close, and insurance rates rising throughout the affected neighbourhoods. Yet despite this toll, neither side showed any inclination to seek peace, and both continued to recruit new members to replace those who had been killed. The violence which had erupted in May 1927 had become a feature of Cleveland's criminal landscape, accepted as inevitable by those involved and viewed with a mixture of fear and resignation by the city's residents. As 1928 began, there was no indication that the violence would abate. If anything, the gang war appeared to be intensifying, with both Irish and Italian criminal leaders determined to establish dominance over Cleveland's lucrative bootlegging trade regardless of the cost in blood and treasure. The stage was set for an even more deadly phase of the conflict, one which would see tactics evolve and the body count rise to levels which would eventually force even the most corrupt and indifferent law enforcement agencies to take action. Cleveland's gang war was occurring during a period when organized crime was flourishing throughout urban America, as Prohibition had created unprecedented opportunities for criminal enterprises willing to supply illegal alcohol to a thirsty public. The 18th Amendment, intended to reduce social problems associated with alcohol consumption, had instead generated a massive illegal industry which enriched criminals, corrupted law enforcement, and spawned violence in cities across the nation. Cleveland's experience, while notable for its particular brutality, was far from unique. and understanding the broader national context of Prohibition-era organised crime is essential to comprehending how local conditions in Cleveland contributed to the deadly gang war between Irish and Italian factions. The scale of illegal alcohol production and distribution in the United States during Prohibition was staggering. Estimates suggest that by the mid-1920s, Americans were consuming approximately half as much alcohol as they had before Prohibition, despite the constitutional ban, and that the illegal alcohol trade generated revenues of between $1 and $2 billion annually. This enormous black market created opportunities for criminal organizations in every major American city, transforming small-time criminals into wealthy gangsters virtually overnight. The profits available from bootlegging were so substantial that they dwarfed the revenues from traditional criminal enterprises such as gambling and prostitution, and they allowed criminal organizations to expand their operations, corrupt officials on an unprecedented scale, and wage sustained campaigns of violence against rivals. Chicago provided perhaps the most notorious example of Prohibition-era gang warfare, with the conflict there serving as a template for violence in other cities, including Cleveland. The Chicago gang wars of the 1920s pitted Italian criminals led by Al Capone against Irish criminals led by George Bugs Moran, and other ethnic groups competing for control of the city's enormous bootlegging trade. The violence in Chicago reached its peak with the St. Valentine's Day Massacre in February 1929, when 7 members of Moran's gang were lined up against a wall in a garage and machine-gunned to death by Capone's men disguised as police officers. This spectacular massacre generated national headlines and public outcry, but it also demonstrated the level of organisation and brutality which Prohibition-era criminals were willing to employ to eliminate competition. New York City experienced similar violence during Prohibition, though the conflicts there were complicated by the presence of multiple Italian Mafia families competing with each other, as well as with Irish and Jewish criminal organisations. The Castellamarus War, which erupted in 1930 and continued into 1931, saw dozens of Italian gangsters killed in a struggle for dominance among Mafia families in New York. This conflict eventually resulted in the establishment of a more formal organisational structure for Italian organised crime, with 5 families dividing control of New York and agreeing to resolve disputes through a commission rather than through violence. However, before this resolution was achieved, the streets of New York saw levels of violence comparable to or exceeding what was occurring simultaneously in Cleveland. Detroit, owing to its location directly across the Detroit River from Canada, became another major centre of bootlegging and gang violence during Prohibition. The city's proximity to Windsor, Ontario, where alcohol production remained legal, made it the primary entry point for Canadian whiskey entering the United States. Criminal organisations in Detroit, including both Italian and Jewish gangs as well as a group known as the Purple Gang, fought for control of the smuggling routes and distribution networks. The violence in Detroit during the late 1920s and early 1930s was particularly severe, with dozens of gangsters killed in shootings and bombings which terrorised the city's residents. The Purple Gang gained national notoriety for its willingness to use extreme violence, including the murder of 3 rival gangsters in 1931 in an incident which became known as the Collingwood Manor Massacre. Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, Kansas City, and numerous other American cities all experienced their own versions of Prohibition-era gang warfare, with local criminal organizations battling for control of bootlegging operations and related illegal enterprises. In each city the pattern was similar. Existing criminal networks, often organized along ethnic lines, expanded rapidly during Prohibition and came into conflict with rival organizations over territory and market share. The enormous profits from bootlegging made violence economically rational from the perspective of criminals, as eliminating competition could result in gains worth far more than the cost of conducting a gang war. Moreover, the corruption of law enforcement which bootlegging profits made possible meant that criminals faced little risk of prosecution for violent acts, further incentivizing the use of violence as a business strategy. The federal government's response to Prohibition-era crime and violence was hampered by limited resources, jurisdictional complications, and corruption within federal agencies themselves. The Prohibition Bureau, the federal agency responsible for enforcing the Volstead Act, was chronically underfunded and understaffed, with only a few thousand agents responsible for enforcing prohibition across the entire nation. Moreover, prohibition agents were poorly paid and received minimal training, making them vulnerable to corruption by the very criminal organizations they were supposed to be investigating. Multiple scandals exposed prohibition agents who were on the payroll of bootleggers, and the public came to view federal enforcement efforts as ineffective and corrupt. The Federal Bureau of Investigation, while more professional and less corrupt than the Prohibition Bureau, had limited jurisdiction over bootlegging cases and focused primarily on other crimes during the 1920s. It was not until the late 1920s and early 1930s that the FBI began seriously investigating organized crime, and even then its efforts were hampered by legal restrictions and by the difficulty of gathering evidence when witnesses refused to cooperate. The FBI's director, J. Edgar Hoover, was initially skeptical of the existence of organized crime as a national phenomenon and was reluctant to commit resources to investigating what he viewed as local police matters. Consequently, federal law enforcement during most of the Prohibition era provided little assistance to cities struggling with gang warfare. State and local law enforcement agencies were similarly ineffective in addressing Prohibition-era violence, though for different reasons. Municipal police departments in cities affected by gang warfare were often thoroughly corrupted by criminal organizations, with officers and even high-ranking commanders accepting regular payments in exchange for protection. In some cities, including Cleveland, the corruption extended to prosecutors and judges, making convictions nearly impossible even in the rare cases when arrests were made. Police raids on speakeasies and bootlegging operations were frequently little more than theatrical performances designed to create the appearance of enforcement, while actually accomplishing little. Criminals often received advance warning of raids from their police contacts, and evidence mysteriously disappeared from custody before it could be used in prosecutions. The economic context of Prohibition-era America also contributed to the flourishing of organized crime and the violence which accompanied it. The 1920s were a period of general prosperity, with American industry expanding, consumer spending increasing, and the stock market reaching unprecedented heights. This prosperity created a large urban middle class, with disposable income to spend on entertainment, including illegal alcohol at speakeasies and nightclubs. The demand for alcohol remained strong despite its illegality, and many Americans viewed prohibition as an unjust and unenforceable law which they felt no moral obligation to obey. This widespread public disregard for prohibition created favorable conditions for bootleggers, who could rely on a steady customer base and on a general reluctance among ordinary citizens to cooperate with enforcement efforts. However, the economic boom of the 1920s came to a crashing end with the stock market crash of October 1929 and the Great Depression which followed. The Depression had complex effects on organized crime and gang warfare. On one hand, the economic hardship experienced by millions of Americans reduced consumer spending on illegal alcohol and other vices, potentially reducing the profits available to criminal organizations. On the other hand, the Depression created a large pool of desperate unemployed men who were willing to work for criminal organizations, providing bootleggers and gangsters with an abundant supply of muscle for their operations. Moreover, the corruption of cash-starved local governments actually increased during the Depression, as underpaid police, officers and officials became even more susceptible to bribes. The ethnic dimension of organized crime during Prohibition was a defining characteristic in cities throughout America, not just in Cleveland. Italian immigrants and their American-born children dominated organized crime in many cities, bringing with them the organizational structures and codes of conduct of the Sicilian Mafia. Irish criminals remained significant players in numerous cities, particularly in Boston, New York, and Philadelphia, where large Irish populations provided both criminal recruits and customer bases. Jewish criminals also established powerful organizations in several cities, with figures such as Meyer Lansky and Benjamin Bugsy Siegel gaining national prominence. These ethnic criminal organizations often competed with one another, and the violence between them was frequently as much about ethnic rivalry and hatred as it was about economic competition. The competition between ethnic criminal groups was complicated by the internal dynamics within each ethnic community. Among Italian criminals, rivalry between Sicilians and southern Italian mainlanders sometimes erupted into violence, as did conflicts between different mafia families claiming authority in the same city. Irish criminal organizations, with their less hierarchical structure, experienced frequent internal power struggles as individual leaders sought to expand their territories at the expense of other Irish gangsters. Jewish criminals, while generally more willing to cooperate across ethnic lines than either Italians or Irish, also experienced internal conflicts. These intra-ethnic conflicts added another layer of violence to the already deadly competition between different ethnic groups. The role of Canadian suppliers in American bootlegging operations was crucial throughout the Prohibition era. Canadian distilleries and breweries, operating legally under Canadian law, produced vast quantities of whiskey, beer, and other alcoholic beverages specifically for export to the United States. The Canadian government officially prohibited the smuggling of alcohol across the American border, but enforcement was minimal, and Canadian producers openly acknowledged that most of their output was destined for the American black market. Cities along the Canadian border, including Windsor opposite Detroit and various towns along the Great Lakes, became major transshipment points, where American bootleggers met Canadian suppliers to take delivery of their illegal cargoes. The smuggling operations across the Great Lakes and along other parts of the Canadian border required significant organisation and investment. Bootleggers needed fast boats capable of outrunning Coast Guard cutters, secure docks where they could land their cargoes, warehouses for storage, and transportation networks to move the alcohol to speakeasies and retail customers. They also needed to maintain relationships with Canadian suppliers, negotiate prices, and arrange payment, often involving large sums of cash. The complexity of these operations favoured larger and more organised criminal enterprises over smaller independent operators, contributing to the consolidation of the bootlegging industry in the hands of major gangs and mafia families. Public attitudes toward prohibition and toward bootleggers evolved throughout the 1920s and early 1930s. Initially, many Americans supported prohibition, or were at least willing to give it a chance, believing the claims of temperance advocates that banning alcohol would reduce crime and social problems. However, as the reality of prohibition became apparent, with widespread bootlegging, the growth of organised crime and escalating violence, public support declined sharply. By the late 1920s, opinion polls showed that a majority of Americans favoured repeal of the 18th Amendment, and the violence of gang wars in cities across the nation contributed to the perception that prohibition had failed. Bootleggers were sometimes viewed as folk heroes by working-class Americans who resented being told they could not drink, though this romantic view was tempered by the very real violence which bootlegging generated. The political coalition which had supported prohibition also began to fragment during the late 1920s. The temperance movement had drawn support from Protestant churches, women's organisations, and rural areas which viewed alcohol as an urban vice. However, urban political machines, ethnic communities, and business interests which suffered from the loss of legal alcohol sales had always opposed prohibition. As the economic and social costs of prohibition became undeniable, the pro-prohibition coalition weakened, and politicians increasingly called for modification or repeal of the 18th Amendment. The Democratic Party formally endorsed repeal in its 1932 platform, and the election of Franklin D. Roosevelt as president that year made repeal all but inevitable. Within this national landscape of organised crime, violence, and evolving public attitudes toward prohibition, Cleveland stood out for the particular intensity and ethnic dimension of its gang warfare. While other cities experienced violence between criminal organisations, few saw the sustained campaigns of bombings and shootings which characterised the conflict between Irish and Italian criminals in Cleveland. The geographic concentration of the violence in specific Cleveland neighbourhoods, the public nature of many of the attacks, and the complete breakdown of law and order in areas where the gang war was most intense, all contributed to making Cleveland's experience uniquely severe. In the spring of 1928, the gang war between Irish and Italian criminal factions in Cleveland entered a new and more deadly phase, as both sides abandoned any remaining restraint and began employing tactics which were more brutal, more public, and more willing to cause collateral damage to innocent bystanders. What had begun as targeted assassinations of individual bootleggers and speakeasy owners evolved into a sustained campaign of terror in which bombs were used with increasing frequency. Family members and business associates of criminals became targets, and entire neighbourhoods lived in fear that they might be caught in the violence. The escalation was driven partly by the desire for revenge for previous killings, partly by the strategic calculation that more extreme violence would intimidate rivals into submission, and partly by a breakdown in whatever codes of conduct had previously governed criminal behaviour. The introduction of car bombs marked a significant tactical shift in the gang war. While explosives had been used since the earliest days of the conflict to destroy warehouses and speakeasies, the deliberate targeting of individuals through bombs placed in their automobiles represented a more personal and more terrifying form of violence. The first confirmed car bombing in Cleveland's gang war occurred on the 3rd of March 1928, when an Italian bootlegger named Giuseppe Marino was killed when he started his automobile and triggered an explosion which destroyed the vehicle and killed him instantly. The bomb had been placed under the driver's seat and was designed to detonate when the engine was started, a method which would be used repeatedly in the months and years that followed. Car bombs offered several advantages to those who employed them. They could be placed when the target's vehicle was unattended, allowing the bomber to avoid direct confrontation and reducing the risk of being identified. They were devastatingly effective, with few victims surviving the explosions, and they created spectacular destruction which served to terrorize not only the intended victims' associates, but also the broader community. The disadvantage was that car bombs required technical expertise to construct and plant, and they occasionally detonated prematurely, killing the bombers themselves. Nevertheless, both Irish and Italian criminals quickly adopted car bombing as a preferred method of assassination. The expansion of targets beyond the primary combatants themselves represented another significant escalation. In the earlier phase of the gang war, most violence had been directed at bootleggers, speakeasy owners, and others directly involved in criminal operations. Beginning in 1928, however, family members and business associates, who were not themselves criminals, began to be targeted, apparently in the belief that killing a gangster's brother or close friend would have as much psychological impact as killing the gangster himself. On the 17th of April 1928, the brother of an Irish gang leader was shot and killed outside his place of employment, a legitimate factory where he worked as a foreman. He had no known involvement in his brother's criminal activities, and his murder was interpreted as a message from Italian criminals that family members were no longer safe. Similarly, legitimate businessmen who sold supplies to criminals or who rented properties to them for use as speakeasies or warehouses found themselves at risk of violence. On the 8th of May 1928, a warehouse owner who had rented space to Irish bootleggers was severely beaten by Italian gangsters who warned him to cease doing business with their rivals. When the owner ignored the warning and continued renting to the Irish, his warehouse was firebombed on the 27th of May 1928, destroying the building and putting him out of business. These attacks on peripheral figures expanded the circle of victims and increased the climate of fear throughout neighborhoods where gang activity was concentrated. The frequency of violent incidents also increased dramatically during 1928. Whereas the previous year had seen approximately 20 murders and a similar number of bombings, the pace accelerated to the point where shootings and explosions were occurring almost weekly by the summer of 1928. Police resources, already stretched thin and compromised by corruption, proved completely inadequate to respond to this surge in violence. Homicide detectives were overwhelmed by cases which they had little hope of solving, given the refusal of witnesses to cooperate and the destruction of evidence by both criminals and corrupt officers. The backlog of unsolved murders grew to the point where some cases received only cursory investigation. The weapons employed in the gang war also evolved during this period, with criminals on both sides acquiring more powerful and more deadly armaments. Thompson submachine guns, which had been used occasionally in 1927, became increasingly common by 1928. These weapons, capable of firing hundreds of rounds per minute, made shootouts far more deadly and increased the risk to bystanders in the vicinity of attacks. The Italian organization in particular invested heavily in acquiring Thompson submachine guns and other automatic weapons, apparently believing that superior firepower would give them a decisive advantage. Irish criminals responded by acquiring their own automatic weapons and by intensifying their use of explosives, in which they maintained greater expertise. The psychological impact of the escalating violence on Cleveland's residents during this period was profound. Neighborhoods which had been relatively safe now felt dangerous, with residents avoiding being on the streets after dark and businesses closing early to avoid becoming collateral damage. Children were kept indoors during the evenings, and parents walked them to and from school out of fear that stray bullets from a gang shooting might strike innocents. Some families who could afford to do so moved away from neighborhoods where gang activity was concentrated, while those who could not afford to leave simply endured the violence and hoped to avoid becoming victims themselves. The breakdown of whatever criminal code had previously governed behaviour became increasingly apparent during this escalation period. Both Irish and Italian criminals had traditionally followed certain unwritten rules, such as avoiding violence against women and children, conducting business in private rather than public locations, and settling disputes through negotiation when possible before resorting to violence. By mid-1928, these norms had largely collapsed, replaced by a brutal pragmatism which recognised no limits and showed no mercy. The gang war had developed a momentum of its own, driven by cycles of revenge and counter-revenge which made peace increasingly difficult to achieve, even if leaders on either side had desired it. What followed was a period of sustained violence which would leave dozens dead, terrorise entire neighbourhoods, and ultimately force even the most corrupt law enforcement agencies to take action. The bloodiest phase of Cleveland's gang war had begun. The period between the summer of 1928 and the autumn of 1930 saw Cleveland's gang war reach its most intense and deadly phase, as assassinations, bombings, and armed confrontations became regular occurrences, which transformed entire neighbourhoods into war zones. The violence during these years claimed approximately 45 lives, left dozens more seriously wounded, and created an atmosphere of terror which affected not only criminals and their associates, but also ordinary residents who found themselves living in proximity to the conflict. The peak violence period was characterized by an escalating cycle of revenge killings, the widespread use of car bombs and other explosives, increasingly brazen attacks carried out in daylight and in public places, and the eventual breakdown of basic social order in the neighborhoods most affected by the gang war. The summer of 1928 established the pattern which would characterize the bloodiest phase of the conflict. On the 4th of June 1928, an Italian bootlegger named Antonio Sacco was shot to death outside a speakeasy on Mayfield Road at approximately 10 o'clock in the evening. He had been leaving the establishment when two men approached on foot and opened fire with pistols, striking him 6 times before fleeing in a waiting automobile. Witnesses reported seeing the shooting but claimed they could not identify the gunman, though it was widely believed the attack had been carried out by Irish criminals seeking revenge for an earlier killing. Sacco's funeral 3 days later was attended by several hundred mourners and was marked by a massive display of flowers sent by associates in Cleveland's Italian community. Though police surveillance at the funeral noted the presence of numerous known criminals from both factions. Just 12 days later, on the 16th of June 1928, the Irish suffered a major loss when Patrick "Paddy" Ryan, one of John Patrick "Big Jack" Rogan's most trusted lieutenants, was killed in a car bombing which destroyed his vehicle as he drove on West 117th Street. The explosion was so powerful that debris was thrown more than 100 feet in all directions, damaging several nearby houses and injuring a civilian who had been walking on the sidewalk approximately 50 feet from the blast site. Ryan died instantly in the explosion, his body badly burned and dismembered by the blast. The civilian who was injured, a 32-year-old factory worker named William Harmon, suffered shrapnel wounds to his legs and face and required hospitalization for several weeks. His injury marked one of the first documented cases of a bystander being harmed in the gang war, though many more would follow. The assassination of Ryan prompted immediate retaliation. On the 23rd of June 1928, exactly 1 week after Ryan's death, an Italian speakeasy in the Murray Hill neighborhood was bombed during business hours, the explosion killing 2 customers and seriously injuring 5 others, in addition to destroying the building. The bombing was carried out in the late evening when the establishment was crowded with patrons, many of them apparently legitimate customers rather than criminals. The 2 men who were killed were later identified as Domenico Russo and Carlo Benedetti, both of whom worked in legitimate employment during the day and had apparently stopped at the speakeasy for drinks after work. The deaths of these men, who had no known involvement in criminal activity, generated considerable newspaper coverage and public outrage, with the Cleveland Plain Dealer running an editorial condemning the gang war and calling for more aggressive law enforcement action. However, this public outrage did little to slow the violence. On the 7th of July 1928, an Irish rum runner named Dennis Murphy was shot and killed while unloading a shipment of Canadian whiskey at a lakefront dock. His killers had apparently been lying in wait for him, and they ambushed him as he climbed out of his boat, firing multiple shots which struck him in the chest and head. Murphy fell into the water and his body was not recovered for several hours. On the 19th of July 1928, an Italian bootlegger's automobile was destroyed by a bomb, though the intended victim survived with serious injuries to his legs and back. On the 3rd of August 1928, 2 Irish gangsters were shot while sitting in their vehicle on a residential street, both dying at the scene. The frequency and brutality of the attacks accelerated throughout August and September of 1928. On the 14th of August 1928, a particularly brazen attack occurred when Italian gunmen opened fire on an Irish-owned speakeasy on the west side during the afternoon, killing 1 man and wounding 3 others in a fusillade which shattered the establishment's windows and riddled its walls with bullet holes. The attack occurred at approximately 2 o'clock in the afternoon, a time when the streets were busy with pedestrians and traffic, and multiple civilian witnesses observed the shooting. However, as had become routine, none of these witnesses could or would provide useful information to police investigators. On the 27th of August 1928, Joseph Leonardo, who had dominated Cleveland's Italian criminal faction since the early days of Prohibition, was himself assassinated in a killing which sent shockwaves through the city's underworld. Leonardo had been meeting with several associates at a barbershop on Woodland Avenue when gunmen entered the establishment and opened fire. Leonardo was struck multiple times and died at the scene, while one of his associates, John Leonardo, his brother, was also killed in the attack. A 3rd man present was seriously wounded but survived. The assassination of Leonardo represented a significant blow to the Italian organization, as he had been its undisputed leader, and his death created a power vacuum which would eventually lead to internal conflict among Italian criminals competing to succeed him. The killing of Leonardo, however, was not the work of Irish criminals as many initially assumed. Subsequent investigations and testimony from informants revealed that Leonardo had been killed by rival Italian criminals, specifically by associates of Salvatore, Black Sam Todaro, who had been seeking to wrest control of Cleveland's Italian underworld from the Leonardo family. This internal Italian conflict would complicate the broader gang war between Irish and Italian factions, as the Italian organization became divided between those loyal to the Leonardo family and those supporting Todaro and his allies. Nevertheless, the violence between Irish and Italian criminals continued unabated, even as the Italian faction experienced its own internal turmoil. The autumn of 1928 saw no lessening of the violence. On the 12th of September 1928, an Irish speakeasy owner named Thomas Brennan was killed when a bomb destroyed his establishment, the explosion occurring in the early morning hours before the business had opened for the day. Brennan had been inside preparing for the evening's operations when the bomb detonated, and he was killed instantly. On the 6th of October 1928, an Italian bootlegger named Vito Palmieri was ambushed and shot while walking near his home, dying from his wounds before an ambulance could arrive. On the 23rd of October 1928, another car bombing claimed the life of an Irish gangster named Francis Frank Gallagher, who was killed when his automobile exploded as he started the engine. As 1928 drew to a close, both Irish and Italian criminal organizations were suffering significant losses, but neither showed any inclination to seek peace. The Irish faction, while weakened by the deaths of numerous members, including the influential Patrick Ryan, still controlled substantial bootlegging operations and maintained its determination to resist Italian expansion. The Italian organization, now under the contested leadership of various factions following Leonardo's assassination, was similarly unwilling to compromise despite its internal divisions. Both sides continued recruiting new members to replace those who'd been killed, and the profits from bootlegging remained sufficient to finance the ongoing warfare. The year 1929 would prove to be even bloodier than 1928 had been. The violence began early in the new year, with a double murder on the 14th of January 1929, when 2 Irish bootleggers were shot and killed in an ambush on Detroit Avenue. The victims, Michael O'Sullivan and Kevin McCarthy, had been driving together when their vehicle was forced to stop by a truck which pulled in front of them. Gunmen emerged from the truck and from a following automobile and opened fire, killing both men in a matter of seconds. The attack was carried out with such precision and coordination that investigators believed it had been planned by Italian criminals with military or paramilitary training. On the 3rd of February 1929, a particularly brutal killing occurred when an Italian gangster named Rocco Marinelli was abducted from the street in broad daylight, taken to an unknown location, tortured, and then shot to death. His body was discovered 3 days later in a vacant lot on the outskirts of Cleveland, bearing signs of severe beating and torture before he was killed with a single gunshot to the head. The use of torture marked an escalation in the brutality of the gang war, and it suggested that Marinelli had been questioned about Italian criminal operations before being executed. Irish criminals were immediately suspected of the abduction and murder, though no arrests were ever made. The spring of 1929 saw a series of bombings which destroyed multiple businesses and residences. On the 18th of March 1929, the home of an Italian bootlegger was bombed, while his family was inside, the explosion occurring at approximately midnight and collapsing part of the structure. The bootlegger's wife and 2 young children were in the house at the time of the blast, and while the wife suffered minor injuries and the bootlegger himself escaped harm, the deliberate targeting of a family residence represented a violation of what many had considered an inviolable norm against involving women and children in the violence. On the 7th of April 1929, another residence was bombed, this time the home of an Irish gang leader's elderly parents, though fortunately the explosion occurred when the house was unoccupied and no one was injured. On the 1st of May 1929, what would become known as the Collinwood Massacre occurred, marking one of the deadliest single incidents of Cleveland's gang war. 3 Irish bootleggers were meeting in a small office above a store in the Collinwood neighbourhood when Italian gunmen burst into the room and opened fire with Thompson submachine guns. All 3 Irish gangsters were killed in the attack, their bodies riddled with dozens of bullets. Additionally, the owner of the store below, an elderly shopkeeper named Abraham Goldman, who was Jewish and had no involvement in criminal activity, was killed when bullets from the automatic weapons penetrated the floor and struck him as he worked in his store. Goldman's death generated particular outrage, as he was universally recognised as an innocent victim who had simply had the misfortune of renting space to criminals. The massacre prompted calls for federal intervention in Cleveland's gang war, with civic leaders petitioning the Justice Department to send federal agents to investigate the violence and prosecute those responsible. However, these pleas were largely ignored, as federal law enforcement during this period had limited jurisdiction over local crimes and was reluctant to become involved in what was viewed as a municipal matter. The Cleveland Police Department conducted investigations into the Collinwood Massacre, but as with most gang war killings, no arrests resulted, and the case remained officially unsolved. Throughout the summer of 1929, the violence continued with grim regularity. On the 15th of June 1929, an Italian bootlegger was killed in a drive-by shooting while standing outside a Murray Hill restaurant. On the 4th of July 1929, a car bomb claimed the life of an Irish gang member who had survived 3 previous assassination attempts. On the 22nd of July 1929, a gun battle erupted on a residential street when Irish and Italian criminals encountered each other by chance, resulting in 1 death and 3 injuries, including a civilian woman who was struck by a stray bullet while standing on her front porch. The woman, 54-year-old Margaret O'Brien, survived her injury but required surgery to remove the bullet from her shoulder. By the autumn of 1929, the cumulative toll of the gang war was becoming impossible to ignore. Civic organisations, church leaders and business associations all called for action to end the violence, and newspapers ran frequent editorials condemning both the criminals and the apparently corrupt or incompetent law enforcement agencies, which seemed unable or unwilling to stop them. Public pressure on city officials intensified, with the mayor and police chief facing increasingly hostile questioning at city council meetings about their failure to address the gang war. However, despite this pressure, the violence continued with little sign of abating. The final months of 1929 saw several additional killings and bombings. On the 3rd of September 1929, 2 Italian bootleggers were killed when their warehouse was raided by Irish gunmen, who shot both men and then set fire to the building. On the 17th of October 1929, an Irish speakeasy owner was killed in a car bombing outside his establishment. On the 8th of November 1929, a particularly savage attack occurred when Italian gangsters entered an Irish-owned bar and opened fire on the patrons, killing 2 men and wounding 5 others in what appeared to be a deliberate attempt to terrorise the Irish community. As 1930 began, both Irish and Italian criminal organisations were severely weakened by the sustained violence of the previous 18 months. the Irish faction had lost approximately 25 members to killings, including several leaders and experienced bootleggers whose expertise would be difficult to replace. The Italian organisation had suffered similar casualties, and its internal divisions following Joseph Leonardo's assassination had further weakened its operational effectiveness. Nevertheless, neither side appeared willing to seek peace, and the violence continued into the new year. On the 19th of January 1930, John Patrick Big Jack Rogan, the most prominent Irish gang leader in Cleveland, narrowly escaped death when his automobile was bombed, but the explosive device malfunctioned and only partially detonated. Rogan suffered minor burns and cuts from broken glass but survived the assassination attempt. He was reportedly furious at the close call and immediately ordered retaliatory strikes against Italian targets. On the 2nd of February 1930, 2 Italian bootleggers were shot and killed in apparent retaliation for the attempt on Rogan's life. The spring and summer of 1930 saw a gradual decline in the intensity of the violence, not because peace had been negotiated, but because both sides had been severely depleted by casualties, and because law enforcement pressure was finally beginning to have some effect. Federal authorities, responding to political pressure and public outcry, had begun investigating some of the most prominent gang leaders on tax evasion charges, while local police had intensified their raids on speakeasies and bootlegging operations. Moreover, many of the most aggressive and violent individuals on both sides had been killed, and their successors proved somewhat less willing to continue the warfare with the same intensity. However, sporadic violence continued throughout 1930. On the 12th of March 1930, an Italian gangster was killed in a shooting at a downtown Cleveland hotel. On the 6th of May 1930, an Irish bootlegger's vehicle was destroyed by a bomb, though the intended victim was not in the car at the time and escaped harm. On the 14th of July 1930, a gun battle erupted at a lakefront dock where both Irish and Italian rum runners were attempting to unload shipments of Canadian whiskey, resulting in 2 deaths and 3 injuries. By the autumn of 1930, the worst of Cleveland's gang war was effectively over, though isolated incidents of violence would continue for several more years. The total death toll from the peak violence period between mid-1928 and late 1930 was approximately 45 people killed, with dozens more seriously injured. Of those killed, roughly 30 were active members of either Irish or Italian criminal organisations, while the remainder were either peripheral figures such as speakeasy customers and warehouse workers, or were innocent civilians who had been caught in the crossfire. The financial cost of the violence was also substantial, with properties destroyed by bombings, valued at hundreds of thousands of dollars, businesses forced to close, and entire neighbourhoods economically depressed by the climate of fear which the gang war had created. The impact on Cleveland's residents during this period of peak violence was profound and lasting. Families who lived in neighbourhoods where gang activity was concentrated lived in constant fear of being caught in shootings or explosions. Children who witnessed violence or who knew victims of the gang war were traumatised, with some requiring psychological counselling in later years. Business owners in affected areas struggled to maintain operations while dealing with extortion demands, property damage, and customers who were afraid to frequent their establishments. The social fabric of neighbourhoods was torn by the ethnic hatred which the gang war had inflamed, with Irish and Italian residents viewing each other with suspicion and hostility. By late 1930, the circumstances which had fueled Cleveland's gang war were beginning to change in ways which would eventually lead to a fundamental transformation of the city's criminal landscape and to the end of the most intense violence. The man who would eventually play a central role in ending Cleveland's gang war was Elliot Ness, a federal prohibition agent who had been born in Chicago in 1903 and who had gained national prominence for his efforts against organised crime in that city. Ness had graduated from the University of Chicago in 1925 with a degree in business administration and political science, and had initially worked in private business before joining the Prohibition Bureau in 1926. His appointment to investigate bootlegging operations in Chicago had led to his formation of a special squad of agents, popularly known as the Untouchables, who conducted raids on Al Capone's illegal breweries and distilleries. Ness and his agents gained their nickname from their reputation for being incorruptible, refusing the bribes which were routinely offered to prohibition agents by Chicago's criminal organizations. In August 1935, Ness was transferred to Cleveland and appointed as the city's Director of Public Safety, a position which gave him authority over both the police and fire departments. He was 32 years old at the time of his appointment, unusually young for such a significant position. But his reputation from Chicago preceded him, and civic leaders hoped that his aggressive approach to fighting organized crime would succeed where previous law enforcement efforts had failed. Cleveland's gang war had subsided somewhat by 1935 from its peak intensity of 1928 through 1930, but violence continued sporadically, and the criminal organizations which had fought the war remained powerful and still engaged in illegal activities despite the repeal of Prohibition in 1933. However, the situation which Ness encountered in Cleveland in 1935 was different from what he had faced in Chicago. The gang war between Irish and Italian criminals had depleted both organizations and had resulted in the deaths or imprisonment of many key leaders. Moreover, the repeal of Prohibition had eliminated the most profitable source of revenue for these criminal organizations, forcing them to shift their operations to gambling, labor racketeering, and other illegal enterprises which generated substantially lower profits. Nevertheless, the corruption within Cleveland's police force and municipal government remained endemic, and organized crime continued to operate with relative impunity. Ness immediately set about reforming Cleveland's police department, which had been compromised by years of accepting bribes from bootleggers and other criminals. He fired numerous officers who were known to be corrupt or who failed to meet his standards of professionalism, eventually dismissing more than 100 officers during his tenure. He also instituted new training programs, raised hiring standards, and implemented systems to monitor officer conduct and identify corruption. These reforms were bitterly resented by some officers who had grown accustomed to the profitable arrangements they had maintained with criminal organizations, but Ness persisted despite facing threats and attempts to undermine his authority. In addition to reforming the police department, Ness also began building criminal cases against the surviving leaders of Cleveland's Irish and Italian gangs. He coordinated with federal agencies including the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Internal Revenue Service, using the same strategy which had been employed successfully against Al Capone in Chicago. Rather than attempting to prosecute gang leaders for violent crimes, which was difficult owing to the code of silence and the lack of willing witnesses, Ness and his federal colleagues focused on tax evasion and other financial crimes for which documentary evidence could be gathered through subpoenas and audits. This approach had the advantage of not requiring witness testimony and of being prosecutable in federal court where corruption was less prevalent than in local courts. The investigation into Cleveland's organized crime leaders was aided by the willingness of several criminals to cooperate with authorities. Some of these informants were motivated by self-interest, hoping to receive reduced sentences or immunity from prosecution in exchange for their testimony. Others had grown disillusioned with the violence and wanted to leave criminal life, but needed protection from former associates who might view their departure as betrayal. Ness and his colleagues carefully cultivated these informants, offering them protection and incentives to provide information about criminal operations, leadership structures, and financial transactions. One particularly valuable informant was a former Irish bootlegger named William "Billy" Walsh, who had been involved in Cleveland's gang war during its most violent period, but who had become convinced that the criminal life would eventually lead to his death or imprisonment. Walsh began cooperating with federal authorities in 1936, providing detailed information about how Irish criminal organizations operated, who their leaders were, and how they conducted their illegal gambling and labor racketeering operations. His testimony would later prove crucial in several prosecutions, though his cooperation came at significant personal cost as he was forced to relocate to another city under an assumed identity to avoid retaliation. The law enforcement response to Cleveland's gang war, though belated, would eventually succeed in significantly disrupting both Irish and Italian criminal organizations through a combination of corruption prosecutions, tax evasion cases, and traditional criminal charges when evidence permitted. Ness remained in Cleveland until 1942, and during his tenure, he transformed the police department from a corrupt and ineffective agency into a more professional force. While organized crime was not eliminated from Cleveland during his years there, it was substantially reduced, and the open warfare which had characterized the late 1920s and early 1930s did not recur. The contrast between the criminal figures who had waged Cleveland's gang war and law enforcement officials such as Ness, who eventually brought them to justice, illustrated the fundamental conflict between those who sought personal enrichment through violence and lawlessness, and those who sought to maintain order and protect the public. Ness. and his honest colleagues faced significant risks in confronting organized crime, including threats to their lives and attempts by corrupt officials to undermine their investigations. However, they persisted in their efforts, motivated by a sense of duty and by the belief that the rule of law must ultimately prevail over criminal violence. Their eventual success, while incomplete and achieved at considerable cost, demonstrated that even deeply entrenched organized crime could be challenged and weakened through determined and incorruptible law enforcement. By 1931, the intensity of Cleveland's gang war was declining, not through any negotiated peace, but through simple attrition, as both Irish and Italian criminal organizations had lost so many members that sustained warfare became increasingly difficult to maintain. The deaths of approximately 45 people during the peak violence period had decimated the leadership ranks of both factions, while the survivors were exhausted by years of constant vigilance and repeated cycles of attack and retaliation. Moreover, the economic realities of the early Depression years were beginning to affect even illegal enterprises, as unemployed workers had less money to spend on illegal alcohol and gambling, reducing the profits which had fueled the gang war. The repeal of Prohibition on the 5th of December 1933, when the 21st Amendment to the Constitution was ratified, fundamentally transformed the landscape of organized crime in Cleveland and throughout America. The enormous profits which had been available from bootlegging disappeared overnight, as legitimate breweries and distilleries reopened and legal alcohol once again became available. Criminal organizations were forced to shift their operations to other illegal enterprises including gambling, labor racketeering, and loan sharking. But none of these activities generated revenues comparable to what bootlegging had produced during Prohibition's 14-year reign. The economic incentive for gang warfare consequently diminished, though personal hatreds and desires for revenge remained powerful motivators for some individuals. The first major arrest of a Cleveland gang war figure occurred on the 17th of March 1934, when Thomas "Red Tom" Kelly, the Irish gang leader who'd controlled bootlegging operations on Cleveland's east side, was taken into custody by federal agents on charges of income tax evasion. Kelly had failed to report substantial income from his criminal enterprises, and federal investigators had gathered documentary evidence of his expenditures and lifestyle which far exceeded his reported legitimate income. He was held on $50,000 bail, which he was unable to post, and remained in custody while awaiting trial. His arrest marked the beginning of a series of prosecutions which would eventually see many of the gang war's survivors imprisoned. Kelly's trial commenced in Cleveland on the 8th of October 1934 in federal court, with prosecutors presenting evidence of his criminal income and his failure to pay taxes on those earnings. The trial lasted 2 weeks, with the government calling numerous witnesses including bank officials, automobile dealers, and property owners who testified about Kelly's financial transactions. Kelly's defense argued that he had been unaware of his tax obligations, and that any failure to report income had been inadvertent rather than criminal, but this argument proved unconvincing to the jury. On the 23rd of October 1934, Kelly was found guilty on 3 counts of tax evasion and was subsequently sentenced to 8 years in federal prison and fined $20,000. Additional prosecutions followed in the years that followed. On the 12th of January 1935, John Patrick "Big Jack" Rogan, who had been one of the most prominent Irish gang leaders throughout the gang war, was arrested on charges of labor racketeering. Federal investigators had gathered evidence that Rogan had been extorting payments from construction companies by threatening labor strikes and violence if contractors did not agree to pay for labor peace. Rogan was convicted in May 1935 and sentenced to 6 years in federal prison. Several Italian gang leaders faced similar prosecutions during this period, with convictions secured through a combination of tax evasion charges, labor racketeering charges, and in a few cases traditional criminal charges for murder and assault where evidence and witnesses could be secured. Some gang war figures managed to avoid prosecution by fleeing Cleveland entirely. Salvatore "Black Sam" Todaro, who had emerged as a leader of one faction of the Italian organization following Joseph Leonardo's assassination, reportedly fled to Sicily in 1934 when he learned that federal authorities were building a case against him. He never returned to the United States and spent the remainder of his life in Italy, dying there in 1952. Others relocated to different American cities where they were less well known to law enforcement and where they could attempt to rebuild criminal enterprises with lower profiles. The golden age of Cleveland's bootlegging empires and the gang warfare they spawned was over, replaced by a new era in which the survivors faced prosecution and imprisonment, while the organizations they had built began to fragment and decline. The final outcomes for those who had participated in Cleveland's gang war were diverse, with some dying violently during the conflict itself, others dying in prison after conviction, and a few managing to survive into old age. Of the approximately 45 people killed during the peak violence period between 1928 and 1930, roughly 30 were active members of either Irish or Italian criminal organizations who died in shootings, bombings, or other violent confrontations. Thomas "Red Tom" Kelly died in federal prison in 1941, having served 6 years of his 8-year sentence for tax evasion before succumbing to heart disease. John Patrick "Big Jack" Rogan was released from prison in 1940 after serving 5 years of his 6-year sentence, but he died just 2 years later in 1942 from complications related to cirrhosis of the liver, his health having been destroyed by years of heavy drinking. Salvatore "Black Sam" Todaro, who had fled to Sicily to avoid prosecution, lived until 1952, dying of natural causes in his hometown. Several lesser figures from both factions served prison sentences ranging from a few years to decades, with some eventually returning to Cleveland after their release, while others relocated elsewhere. The gang war that had terrorized Cleveland was over. Decades after the violence ended, the legacy of Cleveland's gang war remained visible in the city. The neighborhoods which had served as battlegrounds bore the scars of the violence for years to come, with vacant lots where buildings had been destroyed by bombs and with residents who remembered the fear which had pervaded daily life during the late 1920s and early 1930s. The families of those killed on both sides struggled to make sense of the losses they had endured, with widows raising children alone and parents grieving sons who had been killed in the conflict. Some families maintained their silence about their relatives' involvement in the gang war, viewing it as a shameful chapter best forgotten, while others preserved stories and memories which were passed down through generations. The economic recovery of the neighborhoods most affected by the gang war was gradual. Property values which had declined during the violence slowly recovered as the threat of bombings and shootings receded, though some areas remained economically depressed for decades owing to factors beyond the gang war itself. Legitimate businesses which had been forced to close during the violence gradually reopened, though the speakeasies and other illegal establishments which had proliferated during Prohibition disappeared after repeal. The ethnic tensions between Irish and Italian communities, which had been inflamed by the gang war, persisted to some degree, though these gradually diminished as younger generations grew up without the immediate memories of the violence. For those who lived through Cleveland's gang war, the memories of that brutal period remained vivid throughout their lives. In interviews conducted decades later, elderly residents of neighborhoods such as Murray Hill and Collinwood recalled the fear they had felt as children, the violence they had witnessed, and the sense that their city had descended into chaos. Some spoke of specific incidents they had observed, such as the aftermath of bombings or the bodies of murder victims lying in the streets. Others remembered the atmosphere of suspicion and silence which had prevailed, with neighbors reluctant to speak about what they knew and families warning children never to discuss what they saw or heard. Cleveland's gang war between Irish and Italian criminal factions stands as one of the most violent episodes in American organized crime history during the Prohibition era, notable both for the sustained intensity of the conflict and for the ethnic dimension which drove it. The violence claimed approximately 45 lives over a period of several years, with the peak occurring between 1928 and 1930, when bombings and shootings became regular occurrences. What made the conflicts particularly brutal was the willingness of both sides to employ tactics which endangered civilians, to target family members and business associates who were not themselves criminals, and to conduct attacks in public places during daylight hours. The breakdown of whatever codes of conduct had previously governed criminal behavior resulted in a level of violence which shocked even a city grown accustomed to organized crime. The causes of Cleveland's gang war were multiple and interconnected. Prohibition created the economic opportunity which transformed small-time criminals into wealthy gangsters, while Cleveland's strategic location on Lake Erie made it a natural hub for smuggling Canadian whiskey into the United States. The enormous profits available from bootlegging made territorial control valuable and worth fighting for, while the corruption of law enforcement removed the legal restraints which might otherwise have limited the violence. However, economic factors, alone do not fully explain the brutality of Cleveland's gang war. The ethnic dimension was crucial, with Irish and Italian criminals viewing each other not merely as business competitors, but as representatives of rival ethnic groups competing for dominance in the city's criminal underworld and in the broader society. The organisational differences between Irish and Italian criminal enterprises also contributed to the conflict's character. The hierarchical structure of the Mafia, with its clear chains of command and its emphasis on discipline and loyalty, gave Italian criminals certain advantages in sustained conflict. Irish criminal organisations, with their more egalitarian and loosely structured nature, were more flexible, but also more vulnerable to internal divisions and leadership disputes. These structural differences meant that the two sides fought in somewhat different ways, with Italians favouring carefully planned operations and Irish criminals more willing to employ spectacular but less precise tactics such as bombings. Law enforcement's failure to prevent or quickly end the gang war reflected the deep corruption which pervaded Cleveland's police department and municipal government during the Prohibition era. Officers who accepted bribes from bootleggers were unwilling or unable to investigate murders and bombings committed by those same criminals, while prosecutors found it nearly impossible to secure convictions when witnesses refused to testify and evidence mysteriously disappeared. The code of silence, which operated in both Irish and Italian communities, further hampered investigations, creating an environment in which criminals operated with a reasonable expectation of impunity. It was not until the mid-1930s, after the worst violence had subsided, and after reformers such as Eliot Ness began cleaning up the police department, that effective law enforcement responses became possible. The conflict revealed how Prohibition-era economics could transform ethnic criminal networks into heavily armed factions willing to wage sustained warfare for territorial control, while also demonstrating the capacity for violence which lay within communities divided by ethnicity and economic competition. The legacy of Cleveland's gang war served as a cautionary tale about the unintended consequences of Prohibition and about the dangers of allowing organised crime to flourish unchecked by effective law enforcement. What do you think of Cleveland's gang war between Irish and Italian criminal factions? Was the violence inevitable given the economics of Prohibition and the ethnic divisions in the city, or could different law enforcement approaches have prevented the worst of the bloodshed? Please let us know in the comment section, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.